Now it's time. Good afternoon, good morning, and perhaps good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Substream 1 Steel Sector. I'm today's moderator for this session, Takashi Kondo from the Ministry of Environment, Japan. I hope you all enjoyed the discussion on transition in steel sector that is fundamental for almost all other sectors. So I will try to make it as productive and interesting for all of you as possible. But before jumping into the discussion, I will proudly introduce the panelists for this session. Okay, from Dr. Keigo Akimoto, Research Institute of Innovative Technology for the Earth, Right. Thank you for joining, Dr. Akimoto. And Dr. Hitoshi Donomai, General Manager, Nippon Steel Corporation and the Japan Iron and Steel Federation. And he is also a member of the Net Zero Steel Initiative, or NZSI. Thank you for joining, Donomai-san. And Dr. Tony Rook from the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, known as GFRANS. He joins this session online. Hi, Tony. Thank you for joining. And Mr. Kevin Rainey, Senior Vice President from Corporate Solutions Sustainalytics, and cannot join us, but sent us a pre-recorded message. I will show it later. Okay, and before starting, let me introduce the basic objective of this session. This session aims to obtain some idea or insight on what is the main issues on steel industry and its transition to net zero, and hopefully insight considering the fundamental role that industry specifically plays in the economy. And on what is the best and of course the insight on what is the best possible and the productive communication between the industry and the financial sector. Okay, and to start with, I will ask the panelists with industrial expertise, Dr. Donomai and Dr. Akimoto, to briefly present what is going on in steel industry, especially, and that is in Japan. And Dr. Donomai, can you go first? And please share the decarbonization milestones and pathways to 2050, and mainly including your NZSI's viewpoint, please.
Thank you very much, Kondo-san. But I'm sorry, I will speak in Japanese. So
please allow me to speak in Japanese from here. I will be speaking in Japanese. I would assume that the steel making and those people who are not familiar to the steel industry is in the audience. So I hope that you will talk about steel making in detail. So first of all, about steel, there are primary route and secondary route. Primary route is the steel making through iron ore, and the secondary route is to make steel from scrap, and this is through EAF. A primary accounts for 70%, and the secondary accounts for 30% of the global steel making. And the issue here is that the primary route, iron ore, is like a gravel and making iron metal from here. And you need to consume a lot of energy, emitting a significant amount of CO2. In the long run, melting scrap to make a steel will be aligned with the direction of decarbonization. But unfortunately, the supply of scrap is not meeting the demand. The society becoming affluent has the correlation with steel making. Toward 2050, the same amount of steel should be produced by the same primary route, and that is the problem. Everyone says it would be nice if we can use scrap, but that is not possible. So decarbonization of a primary route is extremely critical. 90% of the primary route is using the method of blast furnace, and that is from metallurgical coal it's used as a reduction agent and making steel from iron ore. There is a large amount of emission of CO2, but blast furnace carbon should be replaced to hydrogen. This would be one of the pathways. Having said that, in that case, it is not possible to completely switch over to hydrogen. So the remaining of the 10% of the primary route is a direct reduction. We are calling this as DRI, directly reduced iron. And now we are using natural gas in order to reduce. In other words, this is a method to reduce by using gas. And if we replace by hydrogen, we will not be able to produce CO2. And therefore, another pathway is to shift toward that direction. So, in summary of what I said, using blast furnace, first of all, and hydrogen will be added to reduce CO2 emission. And if it cannot be reduced, then CCUS will be used, BF plus CCUS and DRI, direct reduce reduction. This methodology and this will be replaced by hydrogen 100%. But there is a need for, so correctly, this will be DRI plus EAF. And green electricity should be used, otherwise it will not come down to zero. And scrap, naturally, requires to have green electricity. Otherwise, it's very difficult to come down to zero. So amongst ourselves, those are the three pathways that we are planning to use to achieve net zero by 2050. So roughly speaking, that is the pathway for steel decarbonization. I will talk about the difficulties later on. So much for now.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Noromai, for providing us with the basic and then some ideas of the fundamental role that the steel industry plays in the economy. So, and then now, Dr. Akimoto, can you provide us Dr. Akimoto and his working group in RIGHT has conducted some scenario research, scenario analysis, and formulated the pathway of the Japanese steel industry. So, Dr. Akimoto, please share the insight from your research, especially on the and the Japanese steels and pathway and its milestones.
Okay, thank you very much. But I will also speak in Japanese, please. So, and please show my slide.
There are just two slides I prepared for today, so I would like to refer to the slide as I explain. As was introduced earlier, I am an expert for system analysis and IPCC. For IPCC mitigation, I am also taking the lead assistant. And from Mr. Kajikawa of METI, as he introduced, I am also serving as a chairman for transition roadmap. So from that perspective, I would like to briefly cover this. If you can take a look at this slide, this is IP6, and this is to achieve a net zero. It shows the result of the analysis. If you can take a look at the left graph, CO2, when it becomes a net zero globally, what will be the typical level of emission? And that is shown by this graph. There are 5 paths, and not necessarily, as you can tell by this graph, it's not becoming zero in each segment. As for some of the hard to abate, there is emission, and this is what we call as a CDR, carbon dioxide removal. But including this kind of technology, there is an offset. Depending on path, the amount or the volume will be different, but it would require to have a negative emission, and the carbon neutrality will not be achieved unless there is offset. So within the sentence, it says that carbon dioxide removal is essential. If you can go to the right graph, order to achieve net zero, it shows the timing by sector. I'm sorry, this is rather busy, but for example, around at the bottom, there is 2% degrees and 1.5 degrees target. And the building, this is for Japan, and the transport and industry. This includes a steel industry as well. And most of them, according to most of analysis, this will not become a zero, as this is as difficult as that. When people say carbon neutrality, people tend to have the illusion that everything will become zero, but that is not the case. So there are some areas where the emissions still remain. Technically, this is difficult and it's not economically viable. So negative technology CDR should be used as an offsets. And next is this graph on the left top, and this is an IPCC graph. This shows the fossil fuel and the energy use perspective, and this responds to the previous graph. Naturally, in the future, 2 degrees target and a 1.5 degrees target, and we need to increase the renewables in order to achieve that. The others also require to have nuclear and the CCS. CCS should be added to fossil fuel. So at any rate, these 5 scenarios, the red part is the fossil fuel. And if you can take a look at the 2050, it's not necessarily coming down to zero. It still remains. And this responds to the previous one. So even with fossil fuel, there is a mechanism to offset that. So it's quite diverse to have the forms of carbon neutrality. Today's theme is a transition. Carbon neutrality has various possibilities, and in case of transitions, there are even more possibilities, and there are various pathways. Can come to the lower graph, as was introduced earlier. This is the roadmap which was developed last year for iron and steel, 2050 carbon neutral. This shows the complete carbon neutral by 2050. But as I mentioned earlier, there are some diversities. And even assuming that this becomes a zero, especially in skills sector, it's very difficult for mission, especially how are we going to achieve decarbonization in blast furnace. In 2030 and 2040, there is a gradual reduction. And after that, through innovation to DRI, we are trying to approach to zero. So it's not a linear. So during that time, how are we going to have the finance? And how are we going to obtain the fund to achieve this? And there is a need for discussion. On the other hand, we need to avoid greed given the circumstances. Scientifically, this roadmap should be brushed up. And also, we need to have consistent scenario to 1.5 degree scenario. And over that period, naturally, finance industry and the government, there should be close communication with the industries, the difficulties of technologies and the possibilities of technologies. There should be a good communication amongst them. So as a research institute, we would like to provide support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Akimoto. And then it's very complex and challenging process, and standing on the interdependence of the industry and different industries. So and Dr. Onomai, and you're also from the Japan Steel, the largest steel company in Japan. If you have something to add from the viewpoint or perspective of individual company, and please share it with us.
I was about to mention this earlier, but decarbonization is difficult in this industry. As Dr. Akimoto mentioned, from our perspective, there are 3 pathways: BF, and combined with the CCUS is one of the options. And the second one is hydrogen DRI and also EAF melting and also EAF melting of scrap. So we are doing the research and development of all the pathways. All of them are associated with difficulties. First of all, reduction agent should be replaced to hydrogen from carbon, and the chemical reaction changes completely. Carbon does emit a heat for reduction, so it's easy to work with. But in case of hydrogen, it would remove heat, and there's a difficulty to add heat from external. So that's the challenging point. And CCUS, as we view, this is the next generation technology. It's still difficult, but not from our sector, but we need to collaborate with the other sectors in order to develop this technology and direct reduction technology. Ultimately, this is impressive, but there are also difficulties of a direct reduction. For example, there is selection process for raw materials. It should be high quality, otherwise productivity is not high. There is such issue. And if we use EAF, that will be nice, but it requires to have green electricity. And I talked about the hydrogen, but it should be green hydrogen. Otherwise, it's not meaningful. We need to have various types of research and development, not within this business sector, but unless the infrastructure is established outside, we will not be able to achieve carbon neutrality in the future. This is the difficult point, but from our perspective, we want to provide by receiving the support from the government, we would like to ensure to have technology development.
Thank you, Dr. Donomae. It really needs some, how to say, dynamic and update or updating on technological issues and conditions or under communication with other industries, of course, including financial sectors. Okay, then now let's move on to, and we have heard the voices from the industry side. So let's move on to the ask the, how to say, comments from the financial side. Okay, and we, as I mentioned, we have received video message from Mr. Kevin Rainey. So, and can you play the video? Let's watch this.
Greetings from Canada. I regret that I am unable to be present with you, but I'm nonetheless grateful for the opportunity to address this session on the very important topic of the transition of the steel sector. So I'll share some remarks from the perspective of an external reviewer and provider of second-party opinions on green and transition bond frameworks, where our primary audience is the investor community, which seeks our opinion as to the credibility of green and transition bonds. So as an external reviewer, we recognize the tremendous importance of steel. It is fundamental to many of the products upon which we depend for our social well-being, and it is clearly important to the transition to a low-carbon economy itself. We also recognize the complexity of the steelmaking process and the great challenges of decarbonizing it. And so this calls for a pragmatic approach, and we believe that industry needs to be very much a part of the process of creating solutions. So we can think of transition at multiple levels. There's the level of whole economies, there's the level of the industry, and then there's the level of individual assets and activities. And this is the level that we are focused on when it comes to assessing a green or transition bond framework. And so in doing so, we are asking the question, are the expenditures financed under a transition bond framework contributing to the decarbonization of the activity and its associated assets in a manner that's consistent with international climate goals? This is our essential question. And so in carrying out this assessment, we aim to ground our analysis as much as possible in science and in the scenario analysis of reputable international organizations, most notably the International Energy Agency, or IEA. And our perspective is primarily global. This is because the science is global, and the problem of climate change is global. Many of the technologies and solutions are global in the sense that they are generally accessible globally. And then thirdly, the investor's perspective is largely global as well. Now, having said that, we still recognize that there may be differences among countries and regions with respect to the details of how they make progress along transition pathways, and that certain practical realities should be considered when regions or issuers within regions select from the menu of options that they bring together into a credible transition strategy. So that strategy is really central to how we think about the credibility of a transition bond framework. So I'll shift to that now. When we think of what options are available to issuers in the steel sector, we think in terms of three broad categories of solutions. The first is efficiency in terms of energy and material use. The second is a set of lower carbon solutions, such as lower carbon feedstock into the blast furnace production route, as well as carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Now, these two categories are essential to transition pathways, although alone, they're not going to get us as far as we need to get. So we recognize a third category, which is technologies and methods that are truly aligned with deep decarbonization of steel production. Now, one is electric arc furnace production using recycled steel and powered by renewable energy, which of course is a conventional method already, but we need much more of it. And then there are other technologies that have a ways to go before they can reach commercial scale, such as direct reduction of iron with green hydrogen. Now, across these three categories, there's an extensive menu of actions to be taken, some in the shorter term, some in the longer term, such as the new technologies that are still being developed and have yet to be scaled. Clearly, some of these actions have greater potential for decarbonization than others, and the sector needs to move as rapidly as possible toward those deeper decarbonization technologies. But at the same time, we recognize that there is a very important role for interim solutions as new technologies develop and scale up. And so all of this comes together in a transition strategy at the issuer level. In our view, a strong transition strategy is one that considers options within the right time frame, pushing for deep decarbonization solutions while also deploying shorter term solutions in order to meet shorter term and medium term reduction targets. And of course, we and investors are looking for targets at the issuer level that align with international climate goals, as represented in the work of especially again of the IEA. And so that includes alignment with the carbon intensity thresholds for steel production determined by IEA scenario analysis. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to present some thoughts on behalf of Sustainalytics, and I wish you a productive conversation at the conference. Thank you.
Okay, and he also he mentioned some key factors and consist of the credible pathway and a credible communication between an industry and financial sector. And I think he also pointed out that the diversity of the say transition pathway as well. So now it's Tony. Thank you for waiting so long, and then it's your time to it's your turn, and please share your insight from the investors side, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kondo-san, and thank you for the honor and the privilege of being able to speak today on this fantastic and very important topic of steel. I represent GFANS. I work in GFANS as executive director and technical lead on 2 of our work streams. We are representing $130 trillion of assets in the financial sector and over 450 members from financial institutions across banking, insurance, asset owners, asset managers, and financial services providers, amongst others. Our focus of our work is very much on how to, one, for financial institutes to implement their net zero commitments through transition plans and actions, like Mr. Reni-san said about transition strategies. The second is to mobilize finance to emerging markets. And the third is to engage with public policy, because they're all integrated in making the transition happen. I work specifically in the implementation area, where we are trying to help finance and enable the scaling of climate solutions, helping companies to align to a 1.5 degree pathway through finance, managing phase out and early retirement of high carbon assets where they cannot be decarbonized, and supporting companies already aligned to the 1.5 degree net zero pathway. And I specifically focus on what real economy, for example, steel companies, should be saying in their transition plans, and also the use of pathways. So what we're actually trying to do here is provide guidance to help financial institutions understand what is happening in the sector. And the steel sector is a very important sector if we are to meet our Paris goals from the 2015 climate agreement, but also to decarbonize and to de-risk society. We build upon what Mr. Reni was saying about we're not actually choosing the winners, whether it's in pathways or anything else. As GFANS, we're providing guidance for financial institutions to do that themselves. And one of the tools they use are sector pathways, which other speakers today have also highlighted. And we know this is traditionally a difficult sector to decarbonize. And I think one of the key things there we found through our research and through the pathways is that these are tools that can be used to show how overall the sector needs to decarbonize, down to regional levels, for example, in Japan as well, and potentially what investment is needed and when. Now, obviously, there is a timing and a sequencing issue. And what financial institutions need to understand is what are the strategies or the transition plans that steel companies have. And we're providing guidance on what they expect in terms of information on that. And how are they benchmarking, how are individual companies using the pathways to formulate their transition plans as well. And it's very clear, I won't try to replicate the expertise in the room, because industry bodies and industry representatives are much better at understanding their businesses. We want to understand what information, what investment companies need, what are they trying to, how are they trying to decarbonize and when, and also provide that interface as well, that we recognize that if a company, a steel company, tries to do it on their own, it's going to be that much harder. And we want to see how new ecosystems of finance, multiple industries, and government can help accelerate both the decarbonization of existing assets, the managed phase out of high carbon assets, and also where new climate solutions come in. And previous speakers have talked to the fact that many of the solutions require renewable energy. They require carbon capture, usage, and storage. Facing those costs as just an individual company is going to be that much higher. So we were looking for where companies can join together, share the costs, and share the opportunities from that, whether that's renewable power, storage of that power, creation of green hydrogen from that renewable power as well, and carbon capture and storage. So I think there's an opportunity here for steel to also work with cement, with shipping, with the renewable power, with car manufacturing, and other industrials that also need these solutions. And our role in GFANS is to provide guidance of which pathways may be appropriate for that sector, for that region, and how that can then be used by our members to support that. So this is very much we want to support industry to decarbonize and to decarbonize as fast as possible with government, with policymakers as well, and collectively, because that will also drive returns in the financial industry as well. But also, if we don't, the consequences of not going to 1.5 degree or 2 degree are very, very high in terms of potential losses for everybody. So we see this as a start of a journey. And I would just like to say, from my point of view, Japan has a unique history in the way it can reinvent itself. And this is an industrial revolution. Japan has history of doing that. So I think you are a very strong position to be able to mobilize the finance to decarbonize and to provide the world with green solutions for steel and for other industries.
Thank you, Tony, for very encouraging and encouraging comment. And some of the audience may had the image of the transition finance and the engagement as a somewhat collision process, but it's according to this comment, it's more like a supporting or communication or collaboration process. So I mean, so I'm also from the government, so our government would try to help this transition process as well. So and so now from the financial sector, their own, how to say, attitude or like are shown. So and do you have some reaction from the industry side and about this? I would say they're to say as they're encouraging some collaboration. So do you have any comments? And Dono-san?
Is it about collaboration? Yes. Yes, from that perspective, first of all, to two speakers, I want to thank them that you mentioned that our industry is important and that there is also regionality. You understood that part, and at the same time, a transition is difficult. You have a very good understanding of that. And I would like to express my appreciation for understanding the current status. And the topic that is given to me is about a collaboration. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, a steel business within the boundary improvement or technological development would not be sufficient for carbon neutrality. And thank you very much for understanding that. For example, CC hydrogen and green electricity the surrounding industries or the government should take the lead in order to take the initiative. Otherwise, we need to provide cooperation to do that. So thank you very much for pointing out the important point. With respect to investment, you also mentioned about that, but I would like to take a separate opportunity to comment on
Thank you,
that.
Dono-san. And from the investors, according to the investors' comments, I mean, they also pointed out the importance of the innovation and the technologies to improve and then continuously. And the Akimoto-san also commented about the how to say about somewhat uncertainty of about the future, how to say, technology, but we need some future innovation as well. So can you provide some comment of insight from your observation of the or promising or innovation in Japan going to happen for future?
Yes, thank you very much for raising that. Innovation, whether you ask this is certain or not, it's a difficult part. This applies to all the manufacturing industries, but they are making significant effort to reduce energy. They're trying to do this seriously. So I'm sure that they will address this. And by having the financial support in that area, innovation and carbon neutrality will be achieved. Having said that, what is difficult is that I suppose that technically the carbon neutrality, for example, DRI, there are difficult challenges, but technically it's possible. But what would be the cost associated with that? That's the last mile that is most difficult. Even if we have steel that is extremely expensive, we may be able to compete if we only have that in the world. But some people try to leap forward. And if the other countries just continue to supply low cost steel, if we manufacture expensive steel, there won't be any benefit in terms of CO2 reduction. So we just need to make sure to have the key focus on developing low cost steel. So there are still uncertainties from that perspective. Having many options, just like the technology of CDR, that should be kept as plan B. But we need to achieve carbon neutrality through plan A, through steel. There are many things that are challenging, but I believe in the power of Japanese technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akimoto-san. Do you have anything to add, Doroma-san, from the?
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your support. And from that perspective, about investment, R&D investment, we would probably require to have 500 billion. And also in the implementation, we will need 4 to 5 trillion yen. We officially announced that, as Dr. Akimoto mentioned, we require to have significant amount of running cost. So the steel price would likely to become double. And we also publicly announced that we are hoping that this will be supported by the society as a whole. Ultimately, we are not hoping to have the price increase as an entire society. We hope to have the support. Otherwise, it's difficult to do steel making. We are in such an urgent situation. We are making sure to work on technology development. I hope you will continue to have support.
It's also an issue of responsibility of the steel industry to provide the fundamental material for the economy. Thank you. And so, Tony, do you have any, comments from the financial side to, especially on the how to overcome such kind of uncertainty on the especially in the technological sense, and there is some uncertainty. But how can we overcome this uncertainty and in collaboration between finance and industry? Do you have any comments?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kondo-san. All of the comments highlight the issues that we've got in trying to start. The types of capital costs that my fellow panelists indicated are eye-wateringly high. 5 trillion yen is a lot of money. And in many cases around the world, we're seeing that these costs of new facilities are potentially very high compared to balance sheets. So that's an area that needs to be addressed. Obviously, finance can lean in, but I think this is where we need to have cooperation between finance, public policy, and industry as well, where we can share those costs across industry as well to coordinate. One of the ways that we're seeing this being done is by the creation of green hubs, particularly around hydrogen, renewables, that allow industries to share that infrastructure. So that's number one. Number two, there is a gap in funding as well, and some of that, again, can be provided from finance. That requires some longevity of goals and strategies so that we actually understand what's happening from a financial point of view. But I also think it needs the policy long-term signals as well, that will be fairly stable. I think another one with the, again, apologies if it sounds like I'm asking for policy as well. One of the innovations we've seen in Europe is this CBAM initiative to look at how we can price in or protect industry that's making that innovation and investment into low carbon steel from low cost but high carbon steel by leveling the playing field through carbon pricing. And that, I think, is a really interesting development as well, because then it actually helps support industry. So there's, again, another policy lever that can really help to do that. The final thing, I think, as well, is where industry have reinvestment cycles, refurbishment cycles, CapEx, that they need to do that, is to look at the costs then, because then they will have to already make capital investment to reline, for example, their furnaces, to decarbonize at that point. And then the gap reduces. I won't say it completely closes, but it reduces and makes the business case easier to do. And working with clients as well that also have their own decarbonization targets as well, and say, we want to have green steel. Obviously, everybody is pressed in terms of pricing at the moment. So there is a dialogue, I think, to be had on, if we make this investment, will you also work with us as our clients to purchase those the green steel as well, so that we're making together a long-term investment on that. And we've seen this across other industries, perhaps with shorter investment cycles, to be very successful.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as you mentioned, we need some, maybe, and then Mr. Donovan also pointed out that to, how to say, make the good transition in steel industry, we needed some good circumstance to allow the industry to do that. And we perhaps in that point we don't know which is the, how to say, the very best key to do that. But we are maybe looking for the key. I mean, in the communication between various industries, of course, including financial sector, and also, of course, the government. Okay, and so now it's our time is running out. So now I'm sorry that I already received a question from the audience, but we could not take it explicitly. But in the maybe it's about say carbon pricing. So Tony's comment gave, and I hopefully gave some insight to your question. Okay, and thank you again, and thank you again, Mr. Donomai and Mr. Akimoto and Tony. And I ask the audience to give a big hands to the panelists. Thank you very much.